Alright, for today's module we will be talking about added fullness. And we're just going to focus on added fullness with gathers and pleats. So I have my bodice front here and I've traced out two separate ones. They look exactly the same. I've added some seam allowances here and there, and I've already added some labels right in the middle because I know the design I'm going to use and I know that this area is not going to get touched. So I already went ahead and traced that out so you don't have to watch me do it. If you go to chapter 7 in your book, page 133, it talks about three different kinds of fullness, and I'm going to show all three kinds of fullness on both of these using gathers on one and using pleats on the other. So we're going to use equal fullness, one-sided fullness, and unequal fullness. And that'll become clear as we progress. But if you go to page 133, there is a really good example. There's a picture of the fitting garment and then a girl who has an example of all three types of added fullness in her outfit. So go to page 133 and that'll be a useful image for you to look at to understand perhaps a little bit what they might look like. So I'm going to start out with my gathered bodice. And ultimately, what it's going to end up looking like is something like this. Right here, I've got equal fullness. Right here, I have unequal fullness. And right here, I have, one-sided fullness. And up here, I have unequal fullness. And it just means that this is going to be gathered equally all the way down the front. So it's going between the two dart legs. Here, there's a lot of gathering on one side, and it goes down to 0 on this side, so there's no gathers on the side seam. Up here, there's a little bit of gathering on one side, a lot of gathering on the other side. So they're both gathered, but one is gathered more than the other. So we're going to make this onto this. And what I'm going to do is I have to first decide how much extra fullness I want to add. So I'm going to start with the equal fullness, and I'm going to have that in this section here. And I am just going to square over a line to the point of the dart to the center front. And I'm going to do that a couple places down. I'm actually going to divide this up into, I think I'm going to divide it into 3 different sections. I think I'm going to put them each about 1.5 inches apart. So 1 at 1.5, 1 at 3. And I'm going to square over from center front for each one of those. And what I'm doing is I'm simply indicating a point, a line, where I want to add fullness. So I'm saying this is sufficient right now, but I'm going to stick extra fabric here, extra fabric here, extra fabric here, and once it's all done, this is going to gather up. I have to decide how much extra fullness I want to add. So what I'm going to do is measure from the top down to the bottom and decide what percentage I want to add. So this is about 4 inches. It's a little over 4, but for this, I'm just going to go with a big tick on the ruler. So it's about 4 inches. If I want 3 times the gathers, so take 3 times the amount of fabric and squunch it down into the space of 1 time the fabric, that's going to add a lot of gathers. So 3 times is a lot. It's good. It's a nice amount. It makes it look very full. 2 times is nice. 1 time you start getting into the space where you go, is this a mistake? But 2 to 3 times is a good amount. I think I'm going to do 2 times the amount of fullness. So since this is 4 inches, 2 times the length would be 8 inches. So I've got 8 inches that needs to fit in this space. Currently there's 4, which means I've got 3 spots here to fit an additional 4 inches of fabric. So I'm going to divide that by 3, which equals about 1.33333333. So I'm going to stick probably 1 3/8 of an inch in each one of them. When you're doing added fullness like this, it's okay to be a little bit like about the number and go with big ticks on the ruler. That's okay, because it all gets scrunched together and no one's going to measure it and go, ooh, they were off by 1/4 of an inch on their fullness. So what I will do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to cut down my dart leg. I'm actually going to completely cut out my dart, because when we're done, we won't be able to sew this like a dart. We're just going to have to add seam allowance in here. And what I'm going to do is cut each one of these parts, each one of these lines apart. I'm going to cut it off there, cut it off here, cut it off here. I could just take this down and add it all in one spot, but this helps me kind of see where it's getting added. So I'm going to start spacing these out, and I'm going to add extra paper in here. So that's one thing I'm going to do. I'm going to take an extra piece of paper, just a scrap, something like this, and I'm going to tape my bodice front onto this scrap of paper. But I'm only doing it right at the top. Just doing it in this space right here. Now I'm going to come in with my ruler, and I figured that I need about 1 3/8 of an inch between each of those. So I'm going to draw a line 1 3/8 of an inch down. Before I tape this piece on, I am going to extend my center front line down all the way. This will give me a guide. So now I have this piece that was sitting right here, and I'm going to extend it down and add it right here. And I'll just put tape all the way around it. Now, from the base of this one that I just added on, I need to stick on an additional 1 3/8. And I'll take my next size, plop it here. Now, something that I didn't do that I should have done, so I'm kind of glad I did it this way so that you can see, ooh, here's where you could make a potential mistake. I'm just doing this all the way down until I add the final one. Once the final one is on, then we'll be good to go. Now, the potential mistake I was talking about is the fact that I'm going to gather this. What am I going to gather it back to? That's something that's really kind of important. So it's lucky that I actually have this one that's exactly the same as this one, because what I can do is I can come back in here and I can see that my original line, if I'm measuring this dart leg, or even just the front here, was 4 1/4 inches long. And that number is important, so make sure you write it down someplace just so that you remember. Before you cut anything apart, it's good to remember what this number is, because this is our gather to measurement. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bottom point and blend it up to the dart point. And you'll notice it's going to be cutting off a little edge here, a little edge here, a little edge here. That's okay. It got taken into account as it was expanding. I'm going to come in and I'm going to hash out all of my little lines, because those are not necessary for the construction. I'm going to add my seam allowance. I can actually add my center front and put it on a fold if I want to right now. And I'm going to wait to cut all of this out until later. I am going to get rid of this extra paper here. I can cut out at least this so that it's out of the way. And everything looks clean. I can do that. But now, that 4 1/4, I'm going to create a bracket along this dart leg that says gather to 4¼ inches. That's all it needs. Gather to 4¼ inches. And currently, this would get gathered onto this. This front is still on a fold. And if I wanted to, I could leave it like that, and this garment would be just this center portion. The neckline would be up here. But I do want to change my neckline, so I'm going to do next my one-sided fullness, and that's this section over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decide where I want it to slash open. So I'll have it slash open there. That's about, here I'll give you some numbers so that you can mimic it exactly. From the dart point to a point that's 1/2 inch down over here, from the side, down the side seam, that's 1/2 inch. And then I'm just going to go about every 1.5 inches again, just like the first one. This time, adding in 1.75 inches. We'll do it. Let's just add in 1.75 inches so that we're matching the gathering that's occurring here along here. So what's going to happen is I'm going to slash down each of these lines. But notice I have seam allowance over here, and I didn't slash through it. I am going to make little tiny cuts up to the seam line so that it can hinge beautifully, but I'm going to leave it all attached because this is only one-sided fullness. I don't want to add anything along here. I only want to add along here. So now what I'll do is I'll get a piece of paper. And I'm going to tape it down. But I'm only taping it down at the top. I'm not taping any of these little areas that are floating around. I'm not taping any of them down. These can still move about. And I'm going to, since I'm matching this section over here, I'm going to add 1 3/8 inches right here. I just measured from the dart point, made a little dot. And I'm going to line up this right there. And then I can tape it down. All of it down. Next section, I'm adding 1 3/8 inches. Lining up the point here and taping it all down. And then I can do the same thing to this final section. 1 3/8 inches. Tape it down. And then what I can do to blend across this, because I can't just draw a straight line now, is I can use this leg as the measurement to figure out the curve. So this particular leg of this section is 2.5 inches. So 2.5 inches, make a little mark, 2.5 inches, 2.5 inches, and we're blending between all of those. Do the same thing to this next section. That's 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 inches. Blend between all of those. And then do the same thing to this final section. That's 3 and that number. It might be different on yours. Probably should be about the same. It's about 3¼ inches, just over 3¼ inches. And this blends just like that. Once that's done, I can come in here. I've already got my seam allowances done on this side. I can smooth them a little bit so they're not as pointy. But I can come in and now add my seam allowance for the other leg of this opening. It's no longer, I mean, it's still going to function as a dart by adding shape, but all of this added fullness is making it so that I can't sew it like a dart. But I can cut this out now. Get rid of that. And I have the second portion done, except for one thing. I need to add my bracket here. And I happen to know, because this was 4 1/4, that this should also finish being sewn at 4 1/4. So I'm going to say gather to 4 1/4 inches. Now, I need to change my neckline because according to my sketch, I need to change this neckline. And it's coming in just above the bust point, so I'm just going to find a nice curve and make the neckline a little bit wider. There we go. This is what I want to be my new neckline, which means I no longer need the rest of this. So I'm just going to cut that off. Now I need to decide where I'm going to add my unequal fullness up here. And I think I'm just going to do it in, I'm going to space it out 3/4 of an inch. So at 3/4 of an inch from here, 3/4 of an inch from here, 3/4 of an inch from there. I'm just going to use those 3 spots to add my unequal fullness. So to add my unequal fullness, I'm going to approach this a little bit differently. I am going to cut them all completely apart, but I want to be very controlled about how I add this so that I don't randomly, with these 2 sides over here, with the equal fullness, I was able to get my center front line to be a guide. On the one-sided fullness, this never became detached, so I didn't have to line anything up with anything because it all still just hinged off a certain point. Up here, it's a kind of combination between one-sided fullness and equal fullness, where there becomes a space between them. So you have to figure out, how am I going to make sure that I open this up and space this up so that it's not one direction or the other? And to do that, I'm going to grab an extra sheet of paper, or just scrap paper. And I'm going to tape it down. I'll draw in the lines so you can see it a little bit better. Here's where I'm going to be adding it. And what I want to do is, I think I would like this side over here to be that 2 times fullness, which already I made a mistake. Make sure you have measured this already. I mean, I can figure it out because I know that this is 3/4, this is 3/4, and this is 3/4. So 3/4 plus 3/4 plus 3/4 is 2 1/4 inches. So I know that this all needs to return to 2 1/4 inches on this side as well as on this side. So remember to take that number before you cut it apart. So if I do 2 times the amount along the side, which I want, then I'm just going to go with this needs to equal 4, so 4 needs to divide up into 3 spots, which is about that 1 3/8 number. It's 1.3333, but 1 3/8 will do the trick. On this inside, I think I only want it to gather, I want it to be a 2-to-1 ratio. So, not a 2-to-1 ratio, I want it to be not about 1 3/8, I think I want it to be more like 1.5-to-1 ratio. So if this is 2 1/4 inches long, and I multiply that by 1.5, ultimately this needs to end up being 3 3/8 when it's done. So 3 3/8 minus the 2.25 that it started as, I have 1 1/8 of an inch that needs to fit into these three spots. So 1 1/8 divided by 3. I need to add 3/8 of an inch into each of these spots. Hopefully that makes sense. You take your number, what you want it to ultimately be, subtract what already exists in the current seam line, and then divide it into the spaces that you have to fill. So what I'm going to do is I know that I need to add 1 3/8 on this side. So I'm going to make a mark right there, and I'm going to line this guy up just like this. And then, I'm actually going to draw that line out. That's actually looking really curvy. Let's not do 1 3/8. Let's just do 1 with the space that's given to us. And the reason why I'm only going to do 1 is because I'm now going to space this out an additional 3/8 of an inch from this over here. And when I add that additional 3/8, it's going to take me up to my 1 3/8 from here. So I'm not going to take 1 3/8 all at once. So I'm spacing this out 1 inch so that it's tilted like that. And then I'm going to take my 3/8 and just move it up like this. I'm just going to create and move it 3/8 of an inch straight up. Once that's in place, tape it down. If you don't want to hash out these old lines, just don't put tape over the top of them and you can erase it later. I'm going to do that again. I want it to pivot an inch. Like this. And then I'm going to square it and move it 3/8 of an inch. And it's going to move to right here. So I'm controlling this distance and this placement from side to side by pivoting it and then moving it 90 degrees straight over that final dimension. You can eyeball it if you want, but ultimately you want to be as precise as possible, and this is a good way to be precise. And do that for the final one as well. Now we just have to come in and blend our lines. So if you have curve, it should be able to just blend nice and easily between each of them because you took it up square. On these, it is okay if you take the center point here and do math, or in this case situation, sometimes it's a lot easier to find the midpoint of each of these sections and take a nice curve and blend between them from the end and just blend between all of the midpoints. So that it ends up looking something like that. We can come in later, hash out all the little chunks that are no longer necessary, add my seam allowance. This is why I didn't add seam allowance here before, is because I knew I was going to have to redraw everything. Add seam allowance to my neckline. I'm actually going to do that before I draw that one in. I'm going to add a little bit of extra paper here so I can draw through my entire neckline. Sometimes added fullness really makes bizarre shapes. And you just have to trust when you're sewing it that it's going to sew together correctly. And cut all of this out. Come back in, make sure all of my notches are present. This section, add a notch where you're going to finish gathering. Add a notch where you're going to finish gathering here. We can't add notches along center front because it's on a fold in this particular case. This, I already have the points that it's being gathered between. This, I just need to add a bracket here that says gather to 2 1/4 inches because that's the final thing, and that this section also, even though it's larger, also gets gathered to 2 1/4 inches. So it looks funky, but this is the pattern that will make this.